Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are going to do something pretty fascinating. We're going to neutrally and objectively map out the specific arguments, historical narratives, and political frameworks presented in a recent hour-long broadcast from a group called Promethean Action. You know, understanding these underlying frameworks is absolutely crucial for anyone trying to navigate today's hyperpolarized news cycle. When you encounter highly partisan, passionately argued source material, it's incredibly useful to just strip away the emotion and look directly at the ideological anatomy underneath. And that is exactly what we're going to do today, breaking down their worldview piece by piece. Let's dive right in.
Here's a quick look at our agenda for today. We'll be covering Analyzing Promethean Action's broadcast, claims against the SPLC, the demographic realignment theory, defining the American system, the view of the left, and finally, navigating base frustration.
All right, Section 1, Analyzing Promethean Action's broadcast, setting the baseline.
So, who exactly are we listening to? The broadcast is led by Adam Sturman, Barbara Boyd, and Susan Kinda. Now, these hosts view themselves as providing vital, intellectual, and strategic clarity to a conservative base that is trying to navigate a highly complex political landscape. They don't just react to the daily news cycle. Instead, they attempt to interpret current events through sweeping historical parallels and a really strong focus on economic nationalism. By doing this, they lend a sense of epic, almost mythological importance to everyday political news. They essentially see themselves as educators, equipping their audience to understand the unseen forces they believe are actively shaping American politics.
Moving right along to Section 2, Claims against the SPLC, attributing controversial allegations.
Now, rather than just saying they disagree with the political stances of the Southern Poverty Law Center, or SPLC, host Barbara Boyd takes it a massive step further. Using this exact quote, she frames the organization not as an advocacy group, but as a deliberate private intelligence operation. The broadcast argues that the SPLC is a coordinated mechanism designed to target the MAGA movement and Donald Trump directly. This framing completely shifts the nature of their opposition. It moves the SPLC from being a standard political opponent to an active institutional enemy.
To back up that intense worldview, the speakers lay out some highly specific allegations regarding recent arrests tied to the organization. According to the broadcast, the SPLC actually orchestrated the 2017 Charlottesville rally as a deliberate political setup. They claim the organization actively funded small right-wing extremist groups literally just to keep them alive for political optics. They also point to an indictment of a former director alleging she set up false bank accounts and even diverted donor funds to pay the personal living expenses of a neo-Nazi informant. For the hosts, believing this fundamentally shapes their day-to-day political actions. Dismantling this institution is viewed as a critical, systemic victory for their movement, validating their belief that they are fighting a literal orchestrated intelligence apparatus.
That brings us to Section 3, the demographic realignment theory, visualizing shifting coalitions.
Now, the explainer pivots to a really core theme of the broadcast, the argument that a massive, historical demographic realignment is currently underway in the United States. The speakers contrast the political establishment's expectations against their own claims of actual voter behavior in a recent election in an 80% black Detroit district. While they say the media and elite assumed these working-class minority voters would automatically support a Democratic Socialist candidate based purely on identity politics, the hosts argue the reality was a complete rejection of radicalism. They claim these voters prioritized moderate candidates who focused on concrete, everyday issues like blue-collar jobs, skilled trades, and economic stability over sweeping ideology.
To provide evidence for this shifting electorate, they point to a local news clip featuring Detroit Councilwoman Mary Waters, a Democrat, who recently sat down for breakfast with a Republican candidate. In the clip, Waters emphasizes the need to discuss skilled trades and veteran care, and she explicitly urges her constituents to listen to both sides, famously stating they cannot stay on the Democratic plantation. For Promethean Action, this localized anecdote is their definitive proof that their core economic message is successfully breaking through traditional identity-based voting blocks.
The hosts then seamlessly tie this local story to a much larger national narrative by using this quote from Donald Trump's social media. By stating that minority voters are rejecting socialism and flocking to the party of Abraham Lincoln, Trump, and by extension, the hosts, are actively working to rebrand the modern Republican Party. They're framing this shift not as some wild new political phenomenon, but as a long overdue return to the party's true historical roots.
Okay, Section 4, defining the American system, breaking down economic history.
This section right here, it's absolutely vital for understanding their overarching worldview. You really have to look at the specific historical through line they're tracing. They link Abraham Lincoln's policies in the 1860s to Franklin D. Roosevelt's World War II mobilization in the 1940s, all the way to Donald Trump's MAGA movement today. It's like a giant historical puzzle. They argue that what they call the American system is an organic, domestic impulse focused on production and human creativity. According to the broadcast, whenever the nation faces an existential threat, this exact system must be periodically revived by a disruptive leader in order to save the country from total ruin.
They really define the political battlefield in a strict black and white binary. For them, it is not simply a matter of Republican versus Democrat. No, it is the American system of production, pitted directly against a system of globalism and socialism. They contrast domestic manufacturing, rewarding individual labor and reviving skilled trades against a system they argue represents international financial control, collective redistribution, and a green agenda that they claim actively deindustrializes society. There is absolutely no middle ground in this ideological framing.
Next up is Section 5, the view of the left defining the opposition.
So how exactly do they define their opposition? Well, according to the hosts, the left is no longer operating as a traditional political party. Instead, they view it as an oligarchy, in a state of sheer panic because Donald Trump disrupted their carefully maintained post-war rules-based order. They claim this elite operation uses massive billionaire foundations, specifically naming George Soros, to engineer entire social and political ecospheres. Furthermore, the broadcast asserts that because this oligarchy cannot stop the populist revival through normal democratic means, they're intentionally pushing the Democratic Party into explicit radical socialism. Out of sheer desperation to maintain the status quo, the hosts argue the left is activating an extremist wing that is literally willing to burn it down to stop this movement and destroy Western civilization as we know it.
Finally, we arrive at Section 6, Navigating Base Frustration, addressing the audience Q&A.
During a live Q&A segment, we get this fascinating look at how the hosts manage the very real, very present frustrations of their own base. A 69-year-old viewer named Gregory submits this highly pointed question. He points out the severe economic pain of inflation, living on fixed Social Security, and a perceived lack of promised political justice. I mean, he literally notes that the, quote, criminals haven't been convicted. Gregory's question forces the hosts to reconcile their grand, sweeping, historical theories with the painful, everyday reality of their viewers. It really shows the real-world friction when a movement's supporters feel that leadership isn't delivering results fast enough to ease their immediate suffering.
So, how do the hosts respond? Well, they definitely don't promise a quick, magical fix. Instead, they counsel their audience to adopt a wartime mentality. They urge viewers to embrace the mindset of the Founding Fathers, who risked absolutely everything, and to recognize the massive systemic roadblocks in their way, things like global financial structures and hostile courts. Crucially, they ask their base to view the current political landscape not as a single chaotic election cycle, but as an ongoing, multi-generational war. They draw a direct parallel to the World War II generation, asking their base to accept temporary economic pain and immense personal sacrifice for the sake of a much greater future victory. This really gets to the core of their base management strategy. The hosts are actively attempting to inoculate their viewers against demoralization by framing inflation and political setbacks not as failures of current leadership, but as necessary, almost noble historical sacrifices against a deeply entrenched enemy. They're giving their audience a profound reason to keep fighting, even when everyday life gets incredibly tough.
As we wrap up this explainer, we have to step back and look at the big picture presented by Promethean Action. They have laid out a meticulous, historically anchored vision of an American system locked in an existential battle with globalism. So the ultimate question left for us to consider is this: will this specific, historically driven vision successfully reshape the American electorate, or will competing forces, both domestic and global, dictate the country's next era? The source material makes their stance abundantly clear, but the actual outcome, well, that remains to be written. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.